Thank you very much. And I'd like to welcome all of you back here this evening for the final week of our series. We've spent the last 6 weeks of our series talking about different mental illnesses. We've talked about bipolar disorder. We've talked about schizophrenia. We've talked about depression. We've talked about the impact of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. And tonight, we kind of put it all together in really talking all about you. That is, we're talking all about families and how it is that families can best help your relative dealing with whatever mental health condition they might be dealing with. The factors we'll be talking about will be common across the different mental illnesses that you've heard about over the course of this series. And in addition to being able to just hear my voice tonight, we're very fortunate that in the latter part of our presentation tonight, we'll be joined by a couple of family members who will be coming up to share their experience of going through dealing with mental illness with a relative. And they and I will be open for questions as we conclude this evening. So as we begin tonight, the key point that I want to share with you is that mental illnesses are family illnesses. And as family illnesses, what we're also saying is that there is a family trauma. And while we know it is the person that experiences the symptoms of the illness, it's the entire family that experiences the trauma of going through the illness. And I want to say that very clearly up front because I know for all of you, you can probably all attest to this fact, that when this hits, it's not just the person going through it and the rest of you on the outside kind of looking in and offering your ideas and support. It's you're in the middle of it. You're in the midst of it. You may feel just as powerless as the person going through it. Just as frustrated, just as angry, just as sad, all of those things. And we need to recognize that trauma. And so as we start talking about treating this as a family illness, the factors you'll hear about tonight will incorporate that. Incorporate that you too will be needing your help and your support as we go along with this. And if we just look at what's happening, it'll make sense. Because the family atmosphere is not just some single stable entity. It's a fluctuating state. It's responsive to many influences. So if the illness were mild, then there would be a lot of order in the many different factors you see here. If the illness were mild, treatment would cure it. Society would be supportive of the person and the family. The treatment system would certainly be supportive. And there would be much fewer problems for you as a family going through it. If it were treated like a medical illness, like cancer per se, we'd see more of that. There's no longer the same stigma around cancer as there was 20 years ago, when it wasn't talked about in the public square. The work of NAMI is hopefully bringing the word of mental illness out, and so that it can be spoken about more in that public square. But unfortunately, the illness is not controlled. And so the person does many things that are going to be disturbing and disruptive to the family member, to society. Perhaps you often first try to cope by reaching out and getting treatment, but have a relative who refuses that treatment, or find a treatment system that's ineffective in being able to help. You try to adapt, do the best you can with maybe what little you know when it first hits, and you really try. Too often, you may encounter professionals or society that will blame the person or blame you as family members. And the end result of all of this becomes this kind of chaos that can exist in that system. There's anger, there's guilt, there's frustration, there's sadness, and we get this negative spiral that occurs. And now we have problems that neither the person nor the family know how to solve. And so we have more and more conflict. We do know that we can do our best to help break that negative spiral if families are educated and taught the skills of how to best help their loved one. And we certainly know that if we can get in and get effective treatment, if professionals and society can respond, then we can help folks move forward. And that's certainly what we endeavor to do. But we don't underestimate what this does to family members. Your great thanks for this work you're doing is an increased risk for stress-related physical health disorders, anxiety and depressive disorders, and alcoholism and substance abuse. And this is the risk that all family caregivers face, not just those dealing with mental illness. Family caregivers for a relative dealing with a physical or mental illness. It's this increased likelihood. And unless you have a big red S on your chest and wear a red cape, you're susceptible to this. So often, I know as a family member, you want so much just to help your loved one that you'll put off whatever's going on with you, out of that care, out of that help for your loved one. And in doing so, that's what invites these disorders to come into play, these issues. I'll give you the metaphor of knowing that when this stuff hits, that you're not in a sprint to the finish line to get the right help and get your relative cured. You may know this, but you have to really take this in. You're not in a sprint. In fact, maybe you're not even in a marathon. Maybe it's best to look at it as a triathlon. Maybe the Ironman triathlon, the one that goes all day, and the one for which the athletes need to take about 7,000 calories of sustenance in order just to finish. So you're needing to take in lots of emotional calories, if you will, along this journey. And you can't wait till you get to the finish line to do it. You're going to have to do it along the way. And we know this risk occurs a little bit differently. So if it's your son or daughter, if it's your spouse, if it's a sibling, it will affect you a little bit differently, just given your role with that person and how it affects you. But know that the effects are pretty pervasive. They're going to hit the entire family. And so we want to recognize that. And also even recognize in your family how perhaps if it's your son or daughter, it hits you different than it hits their sibling. And so recognize that everyone is affected. Just to remind you of this burden that you face, there might be what I'll call the objective burdens. The financial risks, the disruptions in your family life, the poor health we just talked about, the restrictions in your own social life. And then there's these subjective burdens, the one we can't really measure. They're intangible. The sense of grief and loss that you experience, the sense of guilt and shame perhaps you carry around this, the fears around the behaviors that your relative may engage in, and the effects of those, and those worries about the future, or planning for the future. All of those are going to be there for you, and it's always important to keep these in the back of our mind as we're going through this. And then, of course, in addition to this, what I like to say too is that because you're all human, just like the rest of us, we all have our own issues, our own stuff we bring into it as well. So that's going to be a part of it too. So whatever our own stuff is, that's going to get tossed in with this and get amplified along the way. So if you know yourself, you are prone to being anxious, expect this to amplify it. If you're prone to depression, it will amplify it. If you're prone to being a caregiver, this will amplify those aspects of you as well. It can be a challenge, but we want to make sure that you face them. And so, what are some of those main things that are going to be helpful for you to do? I like to think about it in two camps. The first camp is getting help, if you will, with the illness and around the illness. What do we mean here? We mean connecting with NAMI for education, support, advocacy. Getting the right books, taking a class such as this or family to family, seeking out knowledgeable professionals to help. And then the other side of it is kind of the non-illness stuff. You know, when you're going through something, you also have to just get the support in dealing with life. Meaning your friends and family. Meaning spiritual support, individual prayer, connection with your religious community, and the like. Lifestyle stuff, exercise, all of those things that go in there, social activities, perhaps it's therapy, all these things that are going to be helpful for you as well. And I also like to remind you that when you do this, you also model for your relative the very thing you're probably asking them to do. You're practicing what you preach to them. So even if you think you've got that red cape on, and you don't need it, I'll encourage you to do it as a good model for your relative. So you're probably asking them to do something that maybe they're not too jazzed about doing themselves. So know that you model when you do this. And at the end of the day, remember the serenity prayer, and know that you're going to have to put that one to work too. Perhaps we know this: God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, because we certainly know with this illness there's a lot we cannot change. The courage to change the things that you can, kind of stepping up and stepping in, and the wisdom to know the difference. This you would probably more commonly hear at an Al-Anon meeting, and in fact I know many, many family members will also attend Al-Anon. Maybe in addition to NAMI, or some may find that to be what speaks to them even better, because it's that challenge of stepping in and how do I know if I'm doing too much? And so often, as loving family members, your best efforts are stepping in and might feel like it's doing almost too much because the relative is not responding and you're getting more stressed about it than they are. And Al-Anon becomes a great resource for you. So I wanted to start with that tonight. I usually, or oftentimes have ended by talking about this stuff as family, but I wanted to start with it tonight because I think it's so important, because it really lays the foundation for then everything else that you're doing. In essence, putting yourself in the best position possible to then undertake the very challenging work that we're going to talk about next, which is then interacting with your relative and doing the things that are going to best promote recovery for them. So let's start talking about that a little bit. First, by way of review, mental illnesses, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, we've talked about those as brain illnesses, biological and genetic basis. And we say that so that as family members, you are not the cause of these illnesses. We know that while the things here are not causal, we do know that stress, substance abuse, and the family environment, the family atmosphere, will contribute and play a great role in the recovery process, or on the flip side, in recurrent relapse. And so we know there are things here that we can do that will come into play. And then we know, certainly if we're talking about a young adult or someone more newly diagnosed, that I would say recovery is probable if we can get in and provide that right treatment. As we talked about recovery, we've been talking about to whatever extent that's possible for that person, helping them just take one step further on their journey. When we've talked about state-of-the-art treatment, we've essentially been talking about a three-legged stool. And number one, we talked about a biologically based illness needing a biologically based intervention, being medication. Medication goes in, helps stabilize the biology and stabilize symptoms. It is no cure, it is no panacea, but it is that first step at stabilizing. Then, for the different conditions, we talked about the different types of therapy and rehabilitation, and psychosocial rehabilitation, and working with the person and how to best do that, individually or in group setting, helping them connect with peers. So we've talked all about that along the way. Then tonight, we're really going to focus in on the role, again, that families play in that three-legged stool. Helpful family roles, helpful education that can promote recovery. And again, just that reminder that as we talk about this, that you do not cause mental illness, but what we're going to talk about tonight are not good families, bad families. We're going to talk about a helpful set of skills and what sometimes would be an unhelpful set or an unhelpful match. And know that whether the background is either one of these, the outcome is going to be the same in terms of what we see in terms of incidence of illnesses such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And what do I mean by this, this helpful set of skills? Well, if I know that with schizophrenia, the person needs a calmer environment. And we just happen to have a quiet home. All the other kids are out of the house, and it's a spacious enough home where they have their own room and their own space. We'd probably think that's a pretty good fit for someone with schizophrenia. If you're in a family where you have 7 or 8 kids all still living at home, and there's lots of activity going on in that space, then we start thinking, okay, for our relative, we might have to do some things to help them adapt to this environment. So we're not talking about it's a good family or a bad family. We're just saying how things might best fit the person with the illness, and then how we can best help them, how we can best help them adapt. And we know this is effective. How do we know that? Well, research is going to show us this. So we look at a study that looked at 26 families, and it just looked at relapse rates. This was a study with schizophrenia, and by relapse rate, it was the likelihood the person was going to end up in the hospital. And a few weeks ago, I think, when I was talking about treatment for schizophrenia, I referenced that on antipsychotic medication alone, the relapse rate dropped from like 70% down to 30%. And what you're seeing in the middle bar here is that for folks, no family support or involvement, we see that the relapse rate was about 30%. Then we looked and we saw that some families that just seem to have that natural fit. Maybe they had that quiet home with lots of space for their relative. Maybe they just knew how to talk with their relative that reduced guilt and blame. Didn't get involved in that. Maybe they were just good at keeping emotion kind of low. They just kind of naturally did that stuff. And we saw that in those families, the relapse rate dropped. So we knocked off almost 10%, down to 21%. Then we looked at some families where there was a lot of more disorganization, or a lot of activity, and not understanding, maybe in the best loving efforts, doing things that might be counterproductive for their relative. As we talk about some of the factors tonight, it will make sense of how we can do that. And we saw in those families what happened is the relapse rate jumped up pretty high. And the unfortunate view of this would be saying, we see that families make a big difference, and there's good families and bad families. However, we take those same families with the poor fit of skills. So we got 21%, 48%. Natural fit, poor fit. We take those ones with the poor fit. We provide the education, the skills training. That relapse rate drops down. Look at that, right about the same. Right about that same 20%. So we know that this makes a difference. We know that families can learn. You know that. We all know that now. Families can learn. You can take these skills and use them to best help your relative. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So when we think about this, though, in terms of mental illness, it kind of makes sense how that number can jump up to 48% pretty quickly. When you've got your 12-year-old son going through some problems in school, and you're dealing with those, stuff going on with the school, maybe you go to your PTA meeting, and parents get together and talk about that stuff. And so when that comes up, it's a pretty natural course of action to take. It's one we kind of all know of, and there's no stigma around being a part of a PTA meeting, and we just do that. And so when we need that help, we know where to go. Well, when mental illness hits, how do we know where to go? It's not something that's just talked about so commonly. It's not something that's just part of our pop culture to know, where do you go when mental illness hits your family? And so we might ask that question, right? Where did our role models go? The guy you see up here will probably look familiar to most of you. Ward Cleaver. Remember Ward? And Ward was kind of that role model of father, right? He was calm. He handled things. You know, this episode here, Beaver packed his pillowcase. He got mad, so he's going to run away from home. He's upset. And there's Ward, the model of composure, talking to him, probably knowing that the beaver's going to get probably about 3 houses down the street, get nervous, go into a neighbor's house, and they'll call home, and they'll be back in about an hour and a half, at the most. And sure enough, that's what happens. So Ward knows how to deal with that. If we fast forward this 8, 9 years later, and 20-year-old beaver now comes bombing down the stairs and says, "Dad, I put aluminum foil over all the windows because there's radar beams coming in and they're stealing my brain, they're stealing my thoughts, and it's affecting my brain. And we got to do something about this. We got to go call the police. We got to tell them what's going on because there's something happening. We got to do this." So I guarantee you that the beaver does that, and Ward does not look like that. You know what Ward will look like because you've probably been through what Ward would look like when that happens. So we don't have the natural role models. Right? We don't have them with mental illness. And so thankfully, though, you are all here tonight and you're connecting with an organization like NAMI where you know you're not alone in this. And perhaps there are some great experienced families that you can connect with in NAMI to know that you're not alone and to know that there is things you can do, and there's also only so much you can do sometimes. So when we start learning this stuff, what are the helpful families? Or excuse me, what are the helpful factors? Let me list them here, and then we'll go through them in more detail. So we'll talk about acceptance, accepting the person is ill, how to attribute symptoms to the illness, not the person. We'll talk about setting realistic, attainable goals, ways to include your relative in the family, a concept called a loving distance, and how to keep that, the importance of having a calm atmosphere, giving frequent praise, yet being able to give specific criticism when needed. So the importance of good, healthy communication. And these are all factors shown by research to be important and helpful. You'll also perhaps note that these are going to be the same factors that we talk about in good treatment programs. So especially if you were here when I talked about the psychosocial rehab model with schizophrenia, right? It's the same factors. What do they promote? They promote belongingness. They promote acceptance, opportunity, encouragement. And so we want to build those in as we're talking along the way. And so as we go through this tonight, take this information in, use that knowledge. Don't try and force feed or force fit your relative into the book knowledge. Just use it as you best try to connect with them. Sometimes think of it like being a piano player where you may spend hours going over notes, learning notes and chords, but when you have a performance, you just play. You're not caught up into all of the technique, you just play. And in some ways, this is the part where you're getting all the technique, the technical information, you're putting it all in there. Then when you're with your relative, just be with your relative as best you can. Just be with them. The outcome of all this is really a balance. Some of these things you have some control over, others you have no control over. What are we talking about here? Well, on the one side, the amount of stigma a person might experience. Stressors going on. You have some ability to manage that. The severity of the illness, over which we have no control. Are there other disorders? Is there substance abuse going on? On the flip side, there's lots of different things. We can't underestimate the importance of courage and encouragement to help promote that. Good coping skills, family education and support, social support, peers, as well as the effectiveness of medication. So the outcome of all these things is going to be a real balance, and we do our best to try and tip those scales, all the while knowing that you can't completely eradicate that negative side. And the support you give is also a balancing act. So you'll be hearing about that as we go through tonight. Meaning that there is the possibility of giving too much to our relative, doing too much for them where it actually can be harmful rather than helpful. And we'll talk about what we mean by that. And so there's the flip side of that where doing too little can be unhelpful. And so it'll be different for each one of you. So there'll be no way of saying this is the absolute way to do it. So as you hear about some of these ideas, you'll be thinking about, okay, for my relative, how is this going to play out? So the first one, we'll talk about this idea of taking a helpful perspective. And as we talk about this, many of the ideas that we'll be talking about tonight are ones that kind of are counterintuitive to what pop culture would tell us. Right? Because one thing we know is that, I'm sure you've all heard this, that successful people see the glass as half full, not half empty. Right? So if you're going to be successful, look at the glass half full and not half empty. Problem is, when mental illness hits your family, your glass ain't half full. It's a lot more empty than that. And we want to recognize that. The other piece of it, we do want to recognize that perhaps though the glass is a tenth full. Perhaps there is a tenth that is in there. And we want to be able to recognize that so we can identify what strengths that are there so that we can reinforce those. What is it that even amidst this that we can be grateful for? Perhaps it's a particular resource. Perhaps it's a skill that your relative has. Perhaps it's just the family's ability to come together. What is it that we can begin with and start to build? As in the treatment system, as professionals, I talked about the strengths model, right? Looking at strengths and starting to build from there. Strengths being not just the talents of the person, but also their resources around them. Anything that can be used in a helpful way to promote recovery. And so we can build on this. We can build on this. Goals are going to be out there. Probably your relatives' goals, if they will express them, will probably sound pretty big compared to where you might be in the present. But if we see at least the 1/10, it gives us a place to start. And then start building step by step, which is what we want to do. One other thing that this communicates is to your relative, is that you can see some goodness in them. When they go through this illness, no doubt they've been given a lot of negative messages from people around them, perhaps from the treatment system. If they were at work, employers, coworkers, in school, other students, they face this. They get lots of negative messages. And so they themselves are probably feeling pretty bad, maybe feeling pretty hopeless, or not knowing which way to go. And so if as a family member, all you're doing is you're seeing all that negative stuff too, it reinforces it. So again, here the idea is not to try and paint the rosy picture. It is to try and acknowledge, okay, what are some of the things there that I can highlight and point out as strengths? Not that I'm going to try and convince my relative to say, look how great this is. But just to be able to acknowledge that there are some strengths here that we can build on. So that's that helpful perspective. A last thought about it too is that another part of the helpful perspective is when we can, give them the adult freedoms and choices, the ability to make some choices in ways that are safe and in ways that they can have. So the invitation here is that the tendency might be to micromanage and want to manage everything given what they're going through. And if there's ways to focus on the important things and allow them to have some choices around others, then that will help, again, promote their sense of encouragement. It's also very common in our culture to compare ourselves. Right? How we do it compared to the Joneses, right? What's going on with the neighbors? And it's been going back as far as time. This Far Side cartoon echoes it. Couple sitting on the branch there in the prehistoric times. She turns to her husband and says, and now there go the Wilsons. Seems like everyone's evolving except us, because the Wilsons have a torch with fire. The Wilsons are a step ahead of us. They have more than us. We don't have this. And it can be very hard not to make those comparisons when mental illness hits. It might feel like being less than. A relative is less than, or we feel less than, we feel guilty, and we look around and we see our neighbors whose kids are off doing these, in our mind, wonderful things, and this is where we're at. And it's hard when we see that to deal with it. And it's hard not to make those comparisons. So what can we do? What can we do? Well, first, as a family, it's important that you can acknowledge those losses that you are dealing with, and to be able to mourn or grieve those losses. If it was your son or daughter, you had that hope and dream. They were going to go on to school and get a good job and be independent, get married, have kids, right? On and on. The common dream that as a parent that we would share. And when illness hits, and perhaps it dashes many of those hopes and dreams, or curtails them quite a bit. As a family member, it's a loss for you as well. So you want to be able to acknowledge that and mourn that. And do that not with your relative, not with them. Do it with your family members. Do it with your NAMI Care and Share group. Do it with your friends. Do it with the trusted others that you can rely on. But do acknowledge it and do deal with that grief. Because again, it's one of those things that's going to weigh you down as well. And will also, and by doing so, will help you then come back and be able to help your relative. You can also acknowledge with them if they voice this sense of loss. Right? And you can empathize with them. And again, your role at that point is to be able to empathize with them, but try not to reinforce it by pushing them further down that road by kind of almost like piling on your own sense of loss around it too. Right? Yeah, it's horrible. It's horrible for me. I wanted to see you do all these things, which will probably have them feeling even worse about it. Because they don't want to see you go through it either. They don't want to see you suffer. So again, do mourn that loss, but try not to do that with them. The other thing that I like to think of too is just that story of the parable of talents, where what we're invited to do is not all get to like the very top. Right? It's not that race to just have the most toys at the end of the game. It's whatever I do have, being grateful for what I do have, and then making the most out of that. So wherever my relative is at, that I'm meeting them where they're at and helping them one step further. And that I might be just as proud of that as I am about their brother who just graduated from med school. So if I'm talking to an extended family member, can I identify some of those strengths or some things that my relative with the illness is doing, just as I'm bragging about some of the things that the non-ill relative is doing. So think about how you can also voice that to others, those strengths that are there. One of the other challenges that you face as a family member is that when mental illness hits, adolescence returns. And it doesn't matter if they have aged out of what we think of as adolescence, young adults go back into adolescence. And they do this for a couple reasons. One is that we know biologically, we talked about these illnesses hitting in late teens, early adulthood. And the prodromal symptoms, meaning that things are starting to happen in the brain earlier than we see that first symptom. And we talked about what's called a cortical pruning process. For those of you who missed that, essentially what we said is that in those teen years, something in the brain is starting to go awry. Even though we might not see the illness for a few years later, something is going awry there. So biologically, that development, if you will, is getting arrested in adolescence. And so we're into the 20s, but we're talking biologically about something that was occurring starting in adolescence. So biologically, in a sense, adolescence returns. Just in your interactions with them, perhaps they were off on their own, starting to move forward in life, even independent. Illness hits. They're back under your roof. You have to financially support them. They're dependent on you. But just like every adolescent, they don't want to admit that and acknowledge that. They want to tell you they're independent and can do it. And my friend Jeremy here is going to illustrate your frustration. Jeremy's hanging out in his room with his friends, playing some music, and cheery mom peeks in the door. Jeremy, how would you and your friends like some snickerdoodles? And Jeremy, as the typical adolescent, bolts up, Mom, feel free to embarrass me anytime. She said, all I did was ask if you wanted some cookies. What's wrong with that? Jeremy, well, I guess it isn't what you said, it's sort of how you said it. Of course, Mom said, well, I said it to you in a perfectly polite way. Jeremy's like, well, okay, it isn't how you said it, it's that you sort of exist. So Mom, right, I get it now, right? I exist. My problem, you're 16, my problem is that I exist. It doesn't matter what I do, how I do it, it's wrong. I tell you it's blue, you're going to tell me it's green. I tell you it's green, you're going to tell me it's blue. You face this, right? You face this. In adolescence, we expect it. It comes back in this unexpected way in young adulthood. You want to do your best, you want to help them, and they might blame you. They might blame you for having the illness. They're going to blame you for putting them in the hospital. They're going to blame you for having to take these awful pills. It doesn't matter what you do, how you do it. They want to go out and go to an outing, trying to help them go to the outing, but something about it's probably not going to be good enough. It might not be good enough. And so you might have to face that frustration along the way. And so when that hits, right, we know, what can we do? Well, a few just ideas, strategies. Number one, again, all of these are things that would apply, so if you might think about what worked with a teenager. One is that you limit the amount of advice you give, and limit that input. You keep it to the things that are most important. The old pick your battles. You got to pick your battles here. The battle around taking medication is much more important than the battle of how you dress. So let them dress like these young kids nowadays dress that just looks like ragamuffins. Let them do it if they're going to take their medication for you. Don't pick that fight and have that become the reason that they no longer want to work with you. So limit the input, especially that advice. When you can, give some choices. Give alternatives. Right? Some of that, as parents we know, is a little manipulative, right? Well, you can do either A or B, right? I sound like I'm giving you a choice. I'm really now picking the two things that I want you to do and hoping you at least do one of them. I'm giving you that choice. I'm not saying, hey, how about either take your medicine or not today? That might not be one where I give a choice. But in other ways, you didn't like that doctor. You want to see that doctor again, or do you want to go to a new one? Both choices are around going to a doctor. But I'm giving a choice. It's a way to help empower them along the way. The other thing that helps in adolescence is, who are teenagers going to listen to the most? Other teenagers. So if there's a way to connect with peers, connect with peers. The other thing is they may not listen to you, but maybe they listen to, Uncle Joe. Right? You're the parent. Whatever you do is wrong. But Uncle Joe was always the one that visited, and we always had a good time together. Uncle Joe never enforced the rules because he didn't have to. He could just be the good uncle. And so maybe when there's things that come up, you enlist Uncle Joe to help out and get him involved. Right? You find who is that person you relatively listen to and enlist them to get your support. And in that as well, don't call on them every day to do it because they'll lose their effectiveness as well. Again, pick your battles, but on the important things, okay, who will they listen to better than me right now? And be humble enough to know that that's okay. Be humble enough to know that sometimes they'll listen to this person better than me, and I can accept that. I'm not a bad parent if that's the situation that I'm dealing with. And know that, as we'll talk later about the concept of a loving distance, that when there is a lot of, if you will, rebelliousness that happens like in typical adolescence, so if your relative is really rebellious, argumentative, refusing to follow on treatment and take medication, That sometimes the sad truth is that you may have to be more distant with them than you ideally would want to be. But that it's really the best way to actually help them at that, to do that. So we'll hit on that one a few minutes later when we talk about loving distance. Another concept that I'll talk to you about is called love the person and hate the illness. Love the person and hate the illness. And some of the best, I should say best, some of the most active NAMI families that I've met over the years have been the ones who will really hate these illnesses. And I can't get over it, I hate it. But what they do is they channel that hatred and that energy into advocacy. And so they find a place to do it. So, at the end of the day, if you're not at a place where you can just love this illness, it's okay. It's okay. You can hate the illness, love the person. So what do I mean here? Understand which behaviors you see are symptoms of the illness. You've heard from the other lectures, you've heard what the different symptoms are. You know these are symptoms of the illness. Recognize them as such. They are symptoms of the mental illness. They are not the intentions of your relative. They are symptoms of the illness. Recognize that no one's to blame for symptoms. So you see a symptom. The person is depressed. The person is hearing voices. The person is paranoid. The person is manic. The person is avoiding and withdrawing. That these are symptoms of the condition that they're dealing with. And we want to stay out of the blame game. We want to stay out of that. Perhaps one of the hardest things I invite you to do is to not take those symptoms personally. Not take it personally. And I know this is one of the hardest things. I gave that example of the beaver running downstairs. Your relative comes up to you and says, "You're poisoning my food." How do you not take it personally? You're the one cooking. How do you not take it personally? They're telling you that you're poisoning their food. Right? The challenge is that when I hear that, almost in the back of my mind, I'm saying, the illness is in control right now. The illness is telling me that I'm poisoning my son's food. I know this isn't my son doing this. That's the challenge in terms of not taking it personally. Very, very hard. It's hard not to get hooked into that sometimes. We want to give our account. This will often come into play when, especially around relapse or hospitalizations. Because one thing we know is that memory is impaired oftentimes around relapse. And so the person may not remember the worst parts of their relapse, let them be back in the hospital. The illness may be in control. They were in the midst of psychosis. They also affect how much they remember, or they were manic. And so afterwards, their revisionist history is going to paint a different story about what happened. And we can't convince them otherwise. And the best thing to do is just step out of that. We're going to just step out of that. Not try to convince them that. We're going to shift off of that. And just acknowledge. And so with all of this, the invitation, right, is I reach out to the person and not the illness. I reach out to the person. I recognize that if my son thinks I poisoned his food, that even though it looks like there's this anger coming at me, that's got to be scary. It's got to be scary to think that your food's getting poisoned by your own parent. And so I was trying to keep that in mind. When I see that anger coming at me, there's probably fear underneath, even if they're not even able to tap into it. How can I tap into and connect with my relative when you think about that? How can you best connect in with that? Expectations. Expectations. This is a huge word. We think about this probably in our lives when it comes to work, or career, or education. What are those expectations that we even have set for ourselves? And what are the expectations, perhaps, that we have for our relative? And expectations can be good. They can also get us in trouble with your relative. We set the bar too high. We expect them to get to a certain point. Perhaps we set them up for relapse. repeated failure, right? If we just set that bar way up too high. On the other hand, what if we set them too low? What if our best loving intention, our attitude is, I don't expect anything. You've got a room in the house, it's comfortable, don't do anything. You don't have to do anything. I have zero expectation. Well, in some ways, I can also be communicating a sense of despair, like that I have no hope that you can do anything. And when I say institutionalization, it's almost more of a mentality than it is actual institutionalization. Meaning that the idea that I don't think you can do anything. And we don't want our relative to hear that either. So the challenge becomes, how do I balance it? Having realistic expectation is the balance. That sets the person up for best function, success, sure. Realistic expectations will hone in on just steps along the way. Not so much where I expect it to be, in 10 years from now, but along the way, where can we get to? You might think of a good boss at work. If your boss just sets this bar up too high all the time, you're pretty frustrated, pretty stressed, that you're never doing enough, never good enough. On the other hand, if you have a boss who doesn't expect anything of you, you probably don't do as well as having the boss who sets good goals with you, right? Because the good boss might challenge you, but in a supportive way. And you'll do more than the boss who expects nothing. So, same concept, but of course, tweaked when we're talking about how to best do it with your relative. So you're thinking about that balance that comes in. Another way we think about that with the expectations. Do we just see our relative as a patient, a mentally ill patient, and all that message communicates? And you see this picture of this little boy with the red shirt who's just standing by the lighthouse. Right? All the other kids are kind of launching their boats, but he's fearful. He's still standing by the lighthouse. Do I just see him as the problem? I see him feel as a patient. Do I put the person in that kind of stigmatized role? Or do I find healthy roles for the person to play in the family? Meaning, do I identify some strengths, some interests, some capabilities that they have? Do I find ways that they can best fit? Do I find good roles for them in the family? I remember a story of one family that would have holiday parties every year. And then after their relative got ill, they didn't have a party one year, and were really frustrated thinking that they couldn't have this, because what would happen is, when people would come over, their relative was very manic, obviously very talkative. And one of his beliefs was that he had to save everyone. And so whenever people would come over, he would go up to them and he would just start rattling off all sorts of things and start saving them. And, as you can imagine, over a period of time, people stopped wanting to come over and visit. And so what this family did is thought, okay, well, what are some strengths? They were working with a therapist, and what is something that the person likes to do? And, they used to like to take pictures. It was like, great. Now, this was before they had digital cameras, so they went out and they bought like 6 rolls of film. And they said to their relative, you can really help us at the party. So already now, I've got a helpful role, a contribution for the person to be the photographer at the party. So when people come in, and you need to make sure you get everyone's picture over the course of the evening. And they're thinking that, okay, this will occupy them so that we can have the party. Right? They thought of it kind of just as a way to occupy. And so sure enough, people came, person went up, snapped their picture, right? Got it at the beginning of the night before they spilled food on their nice outfits, took the picture, and then, rather than going on and on to try and save them, said, excuse me though, I have to go now because I have to take pictures of other people. Right? I kept going and doing it. So they broke that pattern of just ongoing, incessant talking to one person. Rolls and rolls of film. They just could snap pictures the whole night. And the byproduct of this was that the pictures actually came out pretty good, and the other people liked them. And then in future years, people would come to the party and look for the person to get their picture taken. So it really turned the whole thing around. And not that we're going to find things that work as well as that all the time, but the idea that the family was creative. They had to get out of the box. Think out of the box and think about what could be some role that our relatives play. What could be a contribution that they can make? And try and include them in that way. And it's really what made all the difference. So with that, what I can do is I like to pause for about 5 minutes, give you a little break, and get a refreshment. We'll come back, I'll talk a little more, and then we'll have our family panel. Okay, I want to present a few more thoughts and ideas, and then we'll invite our family panel to come up and share some of their experience. So along the same idea, we've been talking about balancing expectations. Hope we can put in that same category. What is having realistic hope? And as we've talked about recovery, what we've been talking about is that stepwise progression. One step at a time to best help the person go forward. When we're dealing with these illnesses, however, we know that setbacks or relapse will occur and will be a part of it. And the red circle you see on the slide might indicate one of those periods. There were steps forward happening, and then the red circle of that setback. And our danger is viewing that as failure. Right? If we think of it as failure, I can't do anything, we're going to be in trouble there. On the flip side, there's also a real popular expression in our culture: when you fall off the horse, you get right back on. Now, again, with mental illness, it doesn't apply. So we have to take that popular adage and toss it out. What does apply is that wherever we're at, we still take that stepwise progression. So if I'm at where that red circle is, my goal is just to move one step back up, not try and get back where we just were. One step at a time, back doing that. Other weeks I've talked about the analogy of like an athlete. Right? Kobe Bryant, world-class athlete, in recovery right now from an injury. He can't just go back on the court. He's got to do many, many layers of rehab to get himself back to where he can be effective. Right? It's just a normal part of rehabilitation. So again, the more we can normalize a process like this, it helps us with our own hope as well. And so just recognize that that journey of 1,000 miles begins with one small step. Loving distance. I've mentioned this already to you tonight, this concept. And again, this is one that, as families, you will all know. However, when it comes to mental illness, you're going to have to change how it applies. What are we talking about here? Loving distance is providing the minimum amount of supervision that'll prevent injury, while allowing the person to try, have difficulties coping, and learn and grow from their experience. Let me make this in a simple one that we can probably all understand. So, you see a picture here of my wife with our son when he was about 18 months of age. And he's first learning to climb on a play structure. And as he's learning to climb on the play structure, you notice where she is. She is right there, hands out, so that providing that supervision to prevent the serious injury, right? She doesn't want to fall and really hurt himself. However, she's allowing him to kind of learn to climb up this structure. So she's there for him. Same day, 4-year-old son proudly standing up on the stairs of the same play structure. And you'll notice that my wife is not in that picture. And doesn't that make sense? If she was standing there like she was with the 18-month-old, what message would she be giving him? However, standing back and allowing him to try and do this, he is able to master that and feel confident about it. So it makes sense, and you can probably all relate with this. This is what we're talking about when we talk about a loving distance. It's knowing when being there is helpful and when being there is harmful. So for many things like this, there's just norms that do it. Our society has set a norm that 16 is the age at which you can first start to drive. So there's some things where we know when to step in, when to step back, when these things can happen. And with mental illness, it's going to be really hard because, again, you might not have that role model. What are you going to compare it to? What are you going to base it on? Because it's only going to be based on your relative. So the trick is going to be applying it and where it's needed. So the essential question with this, when we talk about all the balance, the essential question in all of this is essentially, will my intervention, will my stepping in right now help my relative to do more or to do less? When I step in, this thing that I am thinking that I want to do right now for them or with them, is that going to help them move forward or either set them back or keep them stuck? Just like the pictures of my wife and the kids on the play structure. That same idea. So, for example, your relative has been isolating. And there's a day when you're going shopping that they would like to go along with you. Wow, by all means, right? Great, come on along. It's great to have you with me. Wow, you're so helpful. Right? Reinforce it. You're helping them do more. They're getting out. Right? Let's fast forward this. Same family 6 months later, where now the person's going out and doing some light shopping for you on their own. And they come back and say, why don't you just give me a ride today and do it with me? Because that was kind of nice. And it might be one of those times where you would say, it has been so great and so helpful to me that you've been able to do this. Can I encourage you to keep doing that? And maybe that's one of those moments where you step back and encourage them. And by not coming in, maybe you're worried, what's going to happen? So try that encouragement. See what happens. And knowing that sometimes, again, by stepping back may help them do more, be a little bit more independent going forward. So we're talking about communication. A few points. Number one, provide as much support and encouragement as you can. Right? This guy here, he's got signs up from his bedside stand all the way to the mirror in the bathroom, encouraging them all along the way, right? Come on, you can make it, attaboy, keep going, almost there, congratulations, time for a nice shave, right? He's got that support, that encouragement. Provide that support and that encouragement. If you see a behavior that your relative's doing that you want them to do again, reinforce it, reinforce it, reinforce it. Reinforce it. It's okay, don't worry about acknowledging something too much. Really reinforce this thing. Provide that. We need that as a big buffer. And don't take everyday things for granted. We kind of laugh looking at that, right? Because none of us have signs up like that. At least I don't think we do, much as we might like it. But none of us do. We probably figure that, in the morning I just get up, I gotta get dressed, I gotta go out, I gotta work, school, whatever it is, I gotta do that. And we take it for granted. Don't take those things for granted for your relative. For them, getting up and out the door may be a big accomplishment. Just going and doing something. So just acknowledge them. Acknowledge them. And again, depending on your relative, you don't have to sound like a cheerleader if you know that they'll be like, that's a little too much, right? You're all over the top. So do it, but still do acknowledge it, right? In a way that that they'll best hear it. So we want to do that as much as possible. I don't want you to feel like you have to walk on eggshells. This is one of those areas where so oftentimes seeking out help is going to be important and going to be needed. Because when there's something going on, and there can be this kind of double dilemma. That is, the person you know has had a lot of experiences of being hurt, and so you feel maybe reluctant to want to do something you think might hurt them more. And perhaps you also know that they respond pretty poorly to it, and so you're afraid they're going to be hostile back to you, and you don't want to dash their hope. So again, here it is pick your battles, and it is give specific criticism when warranted. And to do that, the challenge here is going to be to do this as non-emotionally as you can. Basically, as even-keeled as you can be with this one. Again, another one of the easier said than done things that I'm telling you, and I realize I'm telling you these things are easier said than done. The idea being that you just state the behavior of what the person did. So no labels around it, no judgments. No when you were inconsiderate, when you were this. Just, when you were late, when you kind of walked into the door without knocking, or when you're just describing a behavior, just describing an objective behavior. Just how it affected me. It upset me, it disappointed me. It interfered with my going out that night that I was going to do. Whatever it is, again, just what that is, what that behavior is. And then your request, in the future, could you? And it's just a request, and you're putting it out. That would be your best kind of model for how to do that. And I do want to give the caution that if you are concerned about hostility, or certainly if you're concerned about violence, that I'm not encouraging you to go home and just try and do this. That those are the moments where you definitely want to seek out help before you're trying to do something where you know it could be dangerous. If you're not worried about danger, if that's not what's going on with your relative, then if you notice you've been hesitant around it, then you might give this a small try, along with all that positive encouragement that we're talking about. What you can do, and this is helpful for all persons, even those who are lacking insight, is what I'm calling leap into effective communication. And this comes from the work of Javier Amador and his book, I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help. One of the best books I would recommend if you're dealing with mental illness. Absolutely, if your relative lacks insight or has limited insight into what's going on in the problem, this would be the first book I would recommend to you. And Amador really showed us that this is a part of the illness itself, and we can see the impairments in the brain that prevent this from happening. And so what he's identified is this model called LEAP to promote effective communication. And he talks about that because the idea here is to be able to engage in a collaborative relationship with your relative. Because we know that the two most important factors in promoting medication adherence are going to be insight and having a helpful, supportive, and understanding person there with the person. So if you're in that role where you are the trusted other, one who listens and understands them, that's one of the best things you can do to promote adherence. Right? The insight one, right, we have a limited ability to manage. We do our best with medication. If it doesn't do it, we do our best to keep working, but we know we're limited at that. How we communicate, though, is something that we can really learn about and do some work. And this is going to be contrary to most communication. In everyday communication, when you hear someone speaking to you, you are filtering what they're saying. You're thinking of how you want to respond. You might think of how it applies to you. And in most communication, that works just fine. We're sharing ideas. You share an idea, I'm like, wow, that clicked on this for me, and I share it back with you. And it works great. So most communication we don't use this. And we don't necessarily need to. But when there's tension, this is going to turn that kind of communication around. And in LEAP, the L is listen. Listen. And when I listen to you, I don't interpret it, I don't edit it, I don't filter it through the way I think of it. I reflect it back to you exactly how you put it to me. So what I'm hearing you say is that I was the one that put you in the hospital last time. That's what happened. Yes. If that's what your relative's telling you. No, we can't argue with them on that. You're telling me that you don't like taking the medication. You don't like the way it makes you feel. I hear you, I understand that. You're telling me that the voices are telling you that that you should be going out and saving people. This is what, am I getting it? So I'm reflecting it back in. My first instinct might not be to do any of those things. It might be if they're attacking me to defend myself. It might be to try and convince them that those voices are not real, or that the voices can't hurt them. Or, and we can go on and on, what we might want to do to try and fix them. But the first step here is to resist all of that and really listen and try and understand their experience. When we do that, we start to de-escalate, start to help calm. Because now, again, I'm starting to hear that, oh, you're listening, you're understanding. If I can do that, then my next step is, and I don't want to rush to this before the person's done, but then when they are finished, try and empathize with them. I want to empathize with them. So, for example, wow, I can imagine they're telling you about all these voices and what they're telling them to do and how they can't go out and do anything. And you've reflectively listened, reflected that back to them. Wow, I imagine that must be really frustrating for you. Or it must be really disappointing that you can't get these things done. So I'm just trying to guess into the feeling that might be there. But I'm open to them correcting me on it. If I'm wrong, it's okay. No, I'm not upset about it. I'm angry. Oh, okay, you're angry about it. Just keep, and go back to listening. Go back to listening. So you're empathizing, you're guessing in there, but you're always seeing, is it accurate? Is it accurate? Then A is agree. And in agree, it might be we agree to disagree. Or I might even have to take a little one down position and apologize that, I'm sorry that some of probably what I might say about this is going to be not what you think about it, or that you think differently than I do about it. And I get that. So I can take a one down, sort of apologize for that. Again, we might agree to disagree on it. And if we can do that, then P, the partner, then we can collaborate on a mutually shared goal. You're telling me your goal is to be able to go out and make some friends. Great, we can work on that. Let's see what what are some ways we can do that? You want to get out and you want to go exercise. Wonderful, what are some things? You want to go to school, whatever it is. We can start with one step at a time. I have to go back and convince you that thing we were disagreeing on and get you to see it my way. If you're willing to take your medication, I don't care why. Great, be thankful for that. Let them keep taking their medication. Let them take their medication if they think it's just to help them sleep at night. You have to convince them that it's for other things too. If they're willing to do it, great. Focus on then what are those goals we can collaborate and work towards together. So those are just a few pieces around communication. And what I want to do is I want to pause here because I want to invite our family panel to come forward. And they're going to share a little bit with you. And after that, they and I will be available to take some questions. So I'd like to welcome our family panel here with us tonight. And so first, let me invite you to introduce yourself and then just share a little bit about what the experience was like when mental illness first hit your family.
Can you hear me? I talk loud as it is, so can you hear me okay? My name is Pam. My loved one is my son Andrew. He is 40 years old. He is now diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. When this first hit our family, Andy was in his early 20s, and we didn't really know what was wrong with him. We didn't know what to do. He was living away from us at the time with a friend. He was living in Las Vegas, and he came home and his hair was long. He had the look of fear on his face. He was lost. He had a bandana around his head. And so being the loving family that we are, even though I'm divorced from my husband, and my older son worked in a mental hospital in Pasadena, we called a family intervention. We called a meeting to discuss this and get a solution. First, we discussed it without Andrew, and then Andrew came into the room and we talked about different plans. And he broke down in that intervention, and at that time we didn't know what his diagnosis was. Luckily, his brother helped get him a meeting with a psychiatrist at the hospital, and Andy was diagnosed with a mood disorder. There was no mention of bipolar. There were maybe psychotic thoughts going in his head. And so it began the road to help for him, so we thought. But as a family, it was also decided that he would come and live with me. As that went on, it changed because he had his road of ups and downs. There were different opinions in that meeting. His father, who's my ex-husband, was in denial. He and his wife thought that Andy was doing this on purpose. He's not really sick. I felt there was something more seriously wrong. My mother was there also, and his brother felt like something was wrong also. But we decided to take action immediately at the very beginning. And there was no denial. Our family is very strong and we were supportive together. So that's what it was like at the beginning, and then it changed.
Hi, my name is Evelyn, and my daughter is 54, and when she was 27, she'd gone through a summer of what was obviously some real depression. She was working, but all she did was work, come home, go to sleep. She was living on her own, but not too far from us. And the psychiatrist she saw at the time saw only this depressed person, gave her antidepressants, and the result was a very serious break. She went manic to the nth degree, was totally out of control to the point where she had to be hospitalized. And so there we were, not really surprised, because as a child she'd shown some manic sort of behaviors, but again, in those days, you gave them, you said they were hyperactive, gave them Ritalin, and she kind of went through a normal adolescence. So how we were was basically confused. There she is in the hospital, and quite unprepared, and our question was, where do we turn for help?
Thank you. We've been talking a lot tonight about helpful factors, unhelpful factors. Can you share a little bit about what were the helpful factors for your relative and for your family in the recovery process?
Things that were very helpful in the beginning for Andy, getting the psychiatrist diagnosis. Start somewhere. Even though the diagnosis that Andrew had changed every year, he has been diagnosed with everything, and ended up with paranoid schizophrenia. Now that I have knowledge, I think he is schizoaffective, but he has had everything. I think another thing that was very helpful was providing a stable environment for Andy. He had just come from living in another state. He was terrified. He was having an episode and we didn't even know it. So he came to live with me. I was the lucky one, even though I love him with all my heart. I was the lucky one, the brunt of all of it. But that's okay. And I found NAMI one afternoon. It was about 180 degrees outside. That was another helpful factor. I could never get them to pick up the phone, so I drove to the parking lot. That's where all the help started for our family, really. And then from there, I took the classes. I encourage you, family to family. I learned a lot. And I got a doctor's help with conservatorship. That's what really opened the door for our family to be able to talk to the doctors when Andy was hospitalized. Otherwise, we wouldn't know, because he's like, I'm not sick, I don't need help. And it's not only when he's well, but when he's not well. He's not med compliant, he doesn't stay on his med. But those things were the most helpful.
Okay, for us, I think the first thing, since we were totally ignorant, was to really learn as much as possible. My background is in education, and so that's the natural thing that I would do. Finding a good psychiatrist, therapist were both very important. Given the horrible experience with the first psychiatrist, we ultimately found a good psychiatrist. Getting my daughter treatment and getting her to comply. And the one thing that I thought for us, and I remember my husband coming home and saying, you know, what do I tell people? And I said, well, if she had a broken arm or diabetes, you'd probably talk to people. I said, why don't you just tell people? And he came home and said, my gosh, this one's brother-in-law is this, and this one's sister has that, and he felt so much better. So I thought the setting aside the stigma, the shame, not being bothered by that, and sharing was very helpful.
Thank you. On the flip side of that, what were some of the unhelpful factors along the way, and how did you deal with them when they came up?
There's so many things, it was hard to narrow this down. But I think at the very beginning, it was Andy's father's continual denial of the illness. And there's a thing with Andy and his father. Andy, in his psychosis, doesn't think that his father loves him. So there's a battle going on within Andy. And now Dan has been educated. I sent him everything from NAMI, and he understands. And it's just very hard for him to accept Andy's illness. I think another thing was not understanding the illnesses until I was educated by Dr. Di Paolo's series and other means. I was very, very active in trying to find out what was wrong. So, and the different diagnoses was really confusing to our family. One doctor would say bipolar, one schizophrenia. Now he has post-traumatic stress syndrome. One therapist told him, so Andy's got all of these things. And he says, Mom, I just don't want to be schizophrenic. You can say, okay, let's call it a mood disorder, Andy, whatever you want, whatever makes you feel comfortable. There was no fighting there. I think not understanding the importance of the medication at the beginning was difficult, because I can remember not trying to force him to take it until I really knew how important it was. And then I was forcing him to take it, and he was more resistant. But it just is a catch-22 with Andy, because if he doesn't take his meds, he ends up in the hospital where he is now. He's in a locked facility. But I think one of the last things that I narrowed down was his dual diagnosis. Andy battles with alcoholism, and I look back now in his childhood in junior high, and Andy was very popular, and his drinking was self-medication. But that doesn't always surface, so it's a constant battle.
I think the frustrations and the things I found most unhelpful were actually the system. The system is not geared to mentally ill people. People don't get it, even doctors don't get it, and there's so much ignorance. And out there, just not knowing where to turn for help. There is help. I've learned that with my experience with NAMI. But the coordination is poor, and you have to work very, very hard on your own to get that kind of help. So, system's not helpful, so you have to help yourself.
Thank you for all these wonderful insights. I want to give you the opportunity now to share maybe those last bits of advice. If there's like maybe a few just solid pieces of advice, the most important wisdom that you can share with families, what might that be?
Once again, I struggled with this last part because there's so many. I would first say don't be in denial. If you're struggling now, accept it, get help, take action. Try not to enable. I've been guilty of being an enabler. When Andy would want money, I'd just give him $20 here and there, and who knows what it went for, alcohol, everything. never give up. Never give up that there's hope out there, because there is. And gain strength by telling your story. Whether you tell it to a friend, whether you tell it to our Care and Share group, it's okay. The more you tell your story, the stronger you will become. You will, believe me. Don't take no for an answer. When your loved one is in an institution or a hospital and they want to discharge them and they can't come home with you, say no. They say, I can't find a place for them. Yes, they can. Yes, they can. Just be strong about that and stand your ground, okay? Be an advocate for your loved one. Andy is now in a locked facility. He has had a very hard last year. Through his road, he's been incarcerated. I have conservatorship. He stole my car. There are so many stories of strength in our family and what had to be done. But he's getting help. He's getting therapy. He's getting structured med control. So over a period of time, he will get better, and we have hope. He's a real hero, Andrew is.
Okay, a piece of advice. There comes several pieces, but again, from my viewpoint, I really believe that you need to inform yourself. And again, this is reading, going to support groups, join NAMI. There you're with people who get it. I think the hardest thing out there is that people simply don't get it. And with a group like this, I think you can find out pretty quickly that you aren't alone.
One of the best opportunities to get good practical education and support is through the NAMI Family to Family program. And we have information about that program here for you. And for any of you who may be out there in the digital world watching this, know that your local NAMI affiliate would have that information. With that, I'd like to open it up for questions that you might have for the panel or myself.
I found that my loved one has changed in that regard. He has seemed to have lost the understanding of how his actions affect other people and how inconsequential or negative that result may be to the other person. And when I tell that to him, he says, I don't care. Or there's this larger ego there than there was before. So what would you advise when you're not able to communicate in that way that you mentioned?
So again, it's one of those concepts that when it doesn't work, don't try and force it. So if you're trying to communicate with your relative and they're not at a place where they will listen to any feedback, or they won't care about it, a couple thoughts. One, it kind of says that loving distance that we've talked about is going to be greater, meaning that I'll probably need to have more distance with them than probably I would want to. And it also means I come back to more of what the leap was saying, and that when I am communicating with them, I'm back to really just listening and empathizing with their perspective on where things are, and hopefully finding other sources besides me to then be the ones who do the interaction with, or maybe invite the other discussions or into treatment.
Yeah, I was wondering, my sister is bipolar, and whenever I talk to her really nicely about something she did that I didn't like, she takes it so personally, kind of like the opposite, where she gets really depressed. And I feel horrible, and I'm not sure what to do. Like, should I just say, I'm sorry and keep distance, or should I just, is that her manipulating me? I can't tell.
It's a great question. The question refers to your relative with bipolar disorder, and when you try to give some feedback or critique, that she takes it so personal. So just a couple of thoughts about it. It's hard to know specific with your situation, but a couple of thoughts. One is that I would, when merited, and when I think it's important, I would do it. I would keep it as non-emotional as I could, keep it brief, acknowledge perhaps how she feels, but then if you're wondering about being manipulated, then just stop there and say, okay, at least to myself, I'm not going to get caught up in this. If she starts trying to make me feel guilty and go on with that, and then observe what happens if you do that repeatedly for a while. If it changes, if she changes some of her behavior, then you know that what you're doing is the right thing. And that, okay, she gets it that what you're calling that manipulation, those behaviors just aren't going to work. And so it gives you that feedback to know if you're doing, what you're doing is working.
How do you get someone diagnosed that has not been diagnosed? How do you take that first step? What is the step to get the person in the door to being diagnosed?
So the question is, how do you take that first step of getting someone in the door to get diagnosed? Any of you want to have that experience you want to share, and then I can add. The question is, are consequences ever appropriate or a way to try and get that person in the door?
What I meant is, let's say that the person's rent is being paid, and they say, well, the family says, well, you won't be paying your rent until you decide to get help.
Oh.
Would that be appropriate?
Well, sure. It's like, I'm helping you, so can you help me? And we were lucky in Andrew's case. We had a friend in the business, and he knew the psychiatrist, and Andy trusted the family. So how did you get the diagnosis?
Actually, as I pointed out, when she had a total meltdown and ended up in the hospital. I mean,
Okay. Yeah, it's
it was
either
that
that,
abrupt.
either they hit rock bottom and they will be diagnosed at some point.
So just to add to what you've heard, the other thing that I encourage whenever you have difficulty engaging with someone is to really hone in on what their goals are. And if in some way they are not, achieving their goals, if they're not achieving their goals, and you can kind of through leaps sort of listen and empathize and understand that, and invite them to, that, and it could be we can go talk to someone, or if you can talk to someone, but it's about helping you get to your goals. So it's not about because you're ill or want to get a diagnosis or any of that, which you know is going to push them away, but it's aligning with their goals a bit. The other side of that question is many times a family will take that line of, especially around medication, that, we'll pay your rent or you can live under our roof. This is one of the things you have to agree to do. Now, I say that with the message that if you say that to your relative, you must be willing to back that up. Don't ever make an idle threat, meaning don't say you must take your medication to be under this roof, and when they refuse, let them still stay there. It's a values decision that every family must deal with, but if you're that strong about it, and you heard stories on the street, in institutions, that may be part of it, but you have to be willing to kind of accept that that may be part of it when you say that. On the flip side, for many families, that's what works. Because the only reason they do it is because I can stay here. I don't really need it, but you let me stay here if I do. One more question, then we're going to pause.
Not a question, but to help you in your decision, my 60-year-old sister chose to go on pills after being on shots for years last December, and then when she ran out, she didn't feel like going out in the rain to get more pills, and so I talked to her on the phone every week, and I could tell she was going downhill. So she lives in a motel in Sacramento, and the motel charges so much that she doesn't have enough money for food to last a whole month. So my brother, who's retired from the youth authority, sends her money every week to help with food. And when we realized that she was on her meds, he said, either you go back on the shots or I'm not sending you any more money. And I went to see her in December. I go up every December, but I'm not able to help financially. And so she went back on the shots, and so she's back on because she knew we meant exactly what we said. So you have to threaten. You have to do something.
Thank you very much. And let's just make a few kind of closing thoughts. First of all, before Bob comes up, I would like to invite you to please thank our wonderful panel tonight for sharing their story. And secondly, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. Your relative may never thank you for doing this, for all the work that you do. But for being here, you really do a lot. You do a lot to help make their life better. But really, the more you're educated, the more everyone is educated, the more we make the lives for all folks with mental illness better, and we improve things. So with that, again, I want to really thank you for being here tonight and throughout this series, and just wish you all the best as you go forward.